I stood in front of the mirror, the early morning light casting a soft glow on my uniform. The deep blue jacket, pressed to perfection, bore the insignia of my rank, Colonel, United States Space Force. My nameplate read, C. Monroe, in silver letters. I adjusted the collar slightly, but no amount of perfect creases could settle the storm inside me. Today was not a day for medals or missions. It was my brother's wedding. A celebration I had promised my mother I would attend no matter what. But promises were easier than presents. Especially when presents meant standing quietly among people who still thought I was wasting my life in a glorified desk job. I held the ivory invitation card between my fingers. Embossed letters announced the grand event, Jonathan Monroe weds Isabel Crawford. Below, the location, Silver Pines Mountain Resort, Colorado Springs. No mention of Claire Monroe. No note about the older sister who had not been home in years. No title. No respect. I wasn't coming as a colonel today. I was coming as the invisible one. The dutiful daughter who chose service over luxury. The older sister who had once chased fireflies with Jonathan in the backyard but now barely received a reply to an email. The lowly soldier in their eyes. A memory flashed. A call from my mother months ago. Her voice had been soft. I know it's far, Claire, but it would mean a lot to the family if you came. I had hesitated, staring at my calendar packed with briefings and secure meetings. But I said yes, for her. I tucked the invitation into my coat pocket. My reflection stared back at me, not as a daughter, not as a sister, not even as a soldier, but as a woman walking into a world that had long forgotten who she was. Today, I would let them forget. Because soon, they would remember. Claire Monroe was 37 years old, tall, poised, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent most of her adult life earning every ounce of respect. Her hair, dark brown and usually tied in a no-nonsense bun, now flowed slightly past her shoulders, a concession to civilian dress codes she rarely entertained. Even in a simple navy blue coat over a cream blouse and slacks, she looked every bit the officer she was. But beneath the polished surface was a woman who had learned to build walls from silence and pride. She had not always been this way. Once, in her early 20s, she was a hopeful aerospace engineering student at MIT, dreaming of building ships that reached the stars. That was before she joined the Air Force, and later transitioned into the newly formed Space Force, carving her name among the elite few entrusted with orbital defense and satellite warfare strategies. Claire now served as a colonel stationed at Peterson Space Force Base. She led a classified division specializing in strategic space asset protection and cyber interception, the kind of work that earned quiet medals, anonymous briefings to high-level government committees, and near-constant emotional isolation. She had no spouse, no children, and no one in her family who truly understood what she did or why she had chosen such a path. Her father, Harold Monroe, was the CEO of Solantra Dynamics, one of the most influential clean energy companies in the world, known for its cutting-edge solar fusion grids and defense energy contracts. He was a titan of industry, a man who believed success was measured by private jets, Forbes features, and IPO numbers. To him, Claire was a bright mind gone astray. A daughter who could have led Solantra into a new era but chose drills, data, and discipline instead. Her mother, Evelyn, was warm but distant. The kind of woman who hosted charity galas and whispered gentle reprimands when Claire showed up to Christmas dinner still in uniform. Claire's younger brother, Jonathan, was the golden child. With his charming smile, a Wharton MBA, and his newly launched renewable tech startup, he had quickly earned the role of heir apparent. The media called him a visionary. Their father called him the one who got it right. In family photos, Jonathan was always centered, framed in accolades. Claire was either absent or placed politely at the edge. Once, Claire had mailed her parents a framed photo of her receiving a joint commendation from NASA and the Department of Defense. When she visited months later, she found the envelope unopened, still sitting in the hallway drawer. She never mentioned it, she just smiled, because silence, she had learned, was the only uniform her family truly respected. The Silver Pines Mountain Resort stood like a glass crown nestled between snow-dusted evergreens, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the pale shimmer of morning frost. From the valet to the concierge, every employee moved with rehearsed elegance. The scent of imported orchids mingled with the soft chords of a live string quartet. Guests in designer coats stepped out of luxury vehicles, laughter already filling the air like champagne bubbles. Claire walked into the lobby alone, her heels clicking quietly against the polished stone floor. A staff member greeted her with a perfect smile, glanced at her invitation, then politely guided her toward the overflow section in the reception hall. Table 19, she noted. Not near the stage, not even near family. Her table mates were strangers, distant acquaintances, one former school teacher, and a couple from the bride's side who seemed just as uncertain about their placement. Claire smiled courteously, folding her hands in her lap as the other guests began discussing investment portfolios and holiday homes. No one asked her name. No one seemed to notice her presence at all. She caught glimpses of her family near the main table. Her brother Jonathan stood tall in a tailored charcoal suit, his arm around Isabel, who looked radiant in an ivory lace gown. Their parents flanked them proudly. The slideshow playing behind the stage was filled with childhood photos: Jonathan learning to ride a bike, Jonathan winning science fairs, Jonathan shaking hands with their father at his college graduation. Claire appeared in only one frame, and even then she was half-turned, caught in the background, saluting in uniform at some forgotten family function. A server approached with a tray of champagne, and as Claire reached for a glass, she heard the familiar baritone of her father's voice through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold Monroe announced, raising his glass, "today we celebrate the beginning of a new legacy. My son, Jonathan, has not only found a brilliant partner but is also reshaping the future of energy. I am proud, deeply proud." The crowd applauded, warm and adoring. Claire clapped too, quietly, politely. Her father continued, glancing toward the towering wedding cake beside him, a 10-tiered masterpiece of sugar and extravagance. With a smirk, he leaned into the mic and said, "Now, tell me, when will a soldier ever afford a cake like this?" Laughter erupted across the room. Guests chuckled, glasses clinked. The smile on Claire's lips vanished. Her heartbeat slowed, not from embarrassment, but from a cold, familiar disappointment. She sat still, her glass frozen halfway to her mouth. One guest near her leaned over and whispered, "Wait, is he talking about someone here?" A woman across the table answered, "His daughter, I think. She's in the military or something. Poor thing." Claire didn't move, didn't speak. She had endured far worse in silence: foreign intelligence threats, command decisions with no room for error, but nothing cut quite like being belittled by her own blood in a room full of strangers. The evening stretched on in a blur of speeches, dances, and toasts. Claire stayed only long enough to honor her mother's wish. She watched her brother and his new wife slice the extravagant cake, cheered when the sparklers lit up the ceiling, and smiled when a distant aunt tried to draw her into small talk about the weather. But as the party grew louder and the stars outside shone brighter, Claire quietly slipped away. No goodbyes, no photos, just the soft sound of her steps as she walked alone across the marble floor and out into the night. The cold mountain air greeted her like an old friend. She took a deep breath, the taste of pine and frost clearing her mind. She stood beneath the stars, her thoughts drifting far from wedding speeches and glittering cakes. In just 1 week, she would walk into a room where her name carried weight. Where her words would decide the fate of a billion-dollar contract. Where the same family that mocked her would have to face who she really was. Not the lowly soldier, not the afterthought daughter, but Colonel Claire Monroe, United States Space Force. And she would not need to raise her voice. Her presence would be enough. 1 week later, the air inside Solantra Dynamics headquarters was sterile, controlled, humming with the quiet authority of precision and power. The building, a sleek, angular glass structure, stood in the heart of Denver's Innovation District, surrounded by autonomous vehicles, vertical gardens, and camera drones that watched everything but noticed nothing. Claire arrived exactly at 0900 hours. Her driver dropped her at the private executive entrance. She wore her formal service dress uniform, the midnight blue fabric tailored sharp against her shoulders. The rows of ribbons on her chest told a silent story of campaigns, sacrifice, and command. Her polished black shoes clicked across the marble floor. Heads turned as she passed reception. Staff paused mid-call, eyes widening at the sight of the uniform. No one recognized her yet. Not without a name tag, not without permission, but they felt the presence. Power did not always announce itself, it simply entered the room and made space for itself. She was met by a young assistant who bowed slightly and said, "Colonel Monroe, right this way. The board is already gathered." Claire nodded once. No smile. No words wasted. She followed the assistant through a series of frosted glass doors, past framed magazine covers of her father, past models of fusion grids and energy domes her family had patented without her. At the end of the corridor was the executive conference room. Inside, 13 men and women sat around a long oval table. Her father, Harold, sat at the far end, dressed in a light gray bespoke suit, fingers steepled before him. Jonathan sat to his right, tapping on a tablet, forehead creased in concentration. The project on the agenda was Orbital Helix, a $1.2 billion bid to power military satellites using fusion loops. Salantra Dynamics needed the military's approval to move forward, and the officer with final authority was already standing at the door. Before anyone could react, a voice called from behind. "Morning, Colonel Monroe," said a tall man in an Air Force general's uniform as he stepped into the room. General Marcus Shields, commander of Joint Space Operations, offered Claire a nod of full recognition. Every head turned. Claire stepped forward and saluted crisply. "Good morning, sir," she replied. Then, turning slightly to the boardroom, she added in a calm, even tone, "Shall we begin?" Her father's hands dropped from the steeple. His eyes were frozen. "Claire?" he breathed. Her brother turned, blinked twice. The room, for a moment, was utterly silent. Claire moved to the table and opened her binder, setting it before her. Inside were classified documents, data analyses, and the assessment protocol for Orbital Helix. The general introduced her formally. "This is Colonel Claire Monroe, Director of Strategic Orbital Acquisition and Security. Space Force. She leads the compliance review for all high-priority orbital infrastructure contracts. The Department of Defense has placed this project under her direct oversight." Someone gasped. Another executive flipped through their notes, searching for her name in the packet. It wasn't there, because they had never expected her to be anything more than the lowly soldier they ignored. Claire didn't glance at her father. She didn't need to. The silence told her everything. She spoke clearly, her voice unshaken. "We are here to discuss both the technical and financial feasibility of the Orbital Helix project. I will require full disclosure of energy storage protocols, system security layers, and cost structure." Jonathan attempted a smile, his tone reaching for charm. "Colonel, Claire, I wasn't aware you were involved in this sector." Claire turned to him, her eyes neutral. "Apparently," she said, "you weren't aware of many things." She looked around the table. "Let's proceed." The tension was palpable. Engineers stammered. Legal advisors adjusted their ties. Claire listened, took notes, and when necessary, asked questions no one else in the room had the depth or clearance to formulate. She knew the vulnerabilities. She had seen the weaknesses in simulation. She had reports from a task force under her command that raised concern over the integrity of the company's encryption protocols and questionable budget allocations, specifically in Jonathan's department. She had come prepared not to attack, but to scrutinize. And scrutiny was a far more devastating force when it came dressed as calm. An hour into the meeting, Claire paused at a financial report. Her fingers tapped once. "There's a discrepancy in the Singaporean R&D branch," she said. "A $42 million invoice labeled auxiliary orbital testing. There is no accompanying evidence that such a test occurred." Jonathan stuttered. "That's a mislabel, probably. I'll have my team look into it." Claire raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "A mislabel on a defense contract," she repeated. "In my line of work, that is not a clerical error. That is a liability." She looked at her father then, directly. "Salantra Dynamics claims to be ready for federal orbital integration. Then it must operate at federal precision. I want a full audit trail on that expense within 48 hours. Her father opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again. The boardroom no longer belonged to him. Not in that moment. Not while his daughter, Colonel Monroe, held the floor. Her tone never rose. Her expression never changed. But the hierarchy had shifted. The balance had turned. The girl he had once dismissed, the woman he had publicly mocked, now held the contract that could determine the company's future. And she didn't have to say a word about it. She only had to do her job. The boardroom's silence lingered long after Claire's last sentence. For the first time in the company's history, Harold Monroe was not the dominant voice in a meeting. He sat back in his chair, lips pressed tightly, eyes flickering from his daughter's crisp uniform to the stunned expressions of his executives. The room was thick with a tension no one dared break. Claire flipped another page in her binder, eyes scanning the lines. Next, she said, we need to address the cybersecurity framework supporting the Helix network. The most recent system analysis shows encryption algorithms vulnerable to quantum decryption within 32 hours of attack. That risk window is unacceptable for an orbital asset of national strategic value. An engineer began stammering something about updates and patches. Claire raised a hand, stopping him without hostility. I'm not here to dismantle the project, she said. But we won't greenlight a system that can be breached before it clears the stratosphere. Her words were not cruel. They were exact. That was the difference between vengeance and leadership. Jonathan leaned forward, sweating slightly under the overhead lights. Claire, he said quietly, we're working with the best contractors in the field. You know how fast tech moves. Some delays are normal. Claire locked eyes with him. Delays are expected. Denials are dangerous. You signed off on this security protocol 6 weeks ago. Either you were unaware of its weaknesses or you ignored them. Which one is it? He swallowed hard, visibly shrinking in his chair. Around them, the board members exchanged glances. One of the CFO's assistants scribbled notes rapidly. The general next to Claire remained composed but clearly observant, watching how she handled not only the data but the people. Claire didn't enjoy watching her brother falter. This wasn't triumph. It was necessary confrontation. He had mocked her silently for years, whispered comments about her uniform, her missed potential. Now he couldn't look her in the eye without blinking. She moved on to the next point, drawing diagrams on the projection screen, walking the board through orbital placement, risk assessment, and international compliance measures. Her knowledge was vast, her command precise. She wasn't showing off. She was executing responsibility. 3 hours later, the meeting concluded. The general stood, shook her hand with full military decorum, and addressed the room. Thank you all. Colonel Monroe will file her preliminary report within the next 72 hours. Solantra's continued involvement in this project depends entirely on its response to the issues identified today. He nodded to Claire once more, then exited. The room began to stir. Executives murmured and rose, some shaking Claire's hand with a mix of awe and uncertainty. One whispered, "Your father never mentioned." Impressive. Claire offered a professional nod but no personal acknowledgement. She gathered her documents, packed her binder, and turned to leave. Before she reached the door, her father's voice stopped her. "Claire," he said, softer than she had ever heard him, "may I speak with you?" Alone. She paused, turned. Of course. Minutes later, they were in the corner office, the same one where she had once been told she was too emotional, too idealistic, too military-minded for the real world. Her father stood by the window, staring out at the skyline. He spoke without looking at her. "You should have told me." Claire's reply was calm. "I did. I sent emails. I invited you to every commissioning ceremony, every award presentation, even the NATO summit. You never came. You never replied." He turned slowly, his expression a mixture of confusion and shame. "I thought you were just managing teams. Writing code. I didn't know. You didn't ask," she said simply. "You assumed." He nodded, voice rough. "I did. I thought you were lost. I didn't realize you were building something greater than I ever imagined." He looked at her then, truly looked, and added, "You didn't need me. But I needed to see you. I'm sorry it took this long." She felt the weight of his apology press into the air between them. Not entirely enough to erase years of silence, but enough to open a small door. "You don't need to say anything else," Claire replied. "Just start seeing me as I am." Her father reached into his desk and held up a photo frame, newly filled. It was a picture of Claire in full uniform, shaking hands with the NATO Secretary General, an American flag billowing behind her. "I asked your mother for this," he said. "I want it in the hall. Next to Jonathan's degree." Claire took a breath. For a moment, it caught in her chest, but she let it settle. "That's not for me," she said. "That's for the girl you ignored." The one who needed you to be proud years ago. He nodded, saying nothing more. And that was enough. She turned, left the office, and walked through the halls of the company her father built, no longer a shadow but a force. Not because she had taken power, but because she had always had it. Today, they saw it. Today, they saw her. 3 days after the meeting, Claire returned to her post at Peterson Space Force Base. The hum of control room servers, the quiet intensity of her team reviewing satellite telemetry, and the coded chatter over secure lines grounded her more than any family dinner or boardroom ever had. But something had changed. Her name now carried weight beyond her rank. Not because of title, but because of presence. Her family had looked her in the eye and seen not just the uniform, but the human being inside it. Not a daughter to control or a sister to fix, but a leader they had failed to acknowledge. She was reviewing new protocols for an orbital asset realignment when an encrypted message flashed across her screen. It was a forwarded memo, internal to Solantra Dynamics, but she had been CC'd directly. From Harold Monroe. It was addressed to the entire company. The subject line read, "On Integrity and Perspective." Claire paused, then opened the file. To the Solantra team, it began. In the past weeks, I've come to understand something I wish I had realized years ago. Leadership is not about building empires. It is about honoring truth and strength wherever it stands. My daughter, Colonel Claire Monroe, is a leading force in national security and orbital strategy. She has achieved what few ever will. I underestimated her. I judged her by the shape of her career, not the scope of her character. That was my failure. I hope our company learns from my mistake. Greatness doesn't always look familiar. Claire sat back. The words weren't perfect. They wouldn't undo the years. But they were real, public, unapologetically proud. And for Harold Monroe, that was no small thing. She forwarded the email to no one. She didn't post it, didn't print it. She simply read it again, slowly, and allowed herself the smallest smile. Her phone buzzed a moment later. Jonathan. The message was short. Lunch? Just us. This weekend? Claire hesitated for a moment, then replied. Sure. Same coffee shop? Saturday came. Claire arrived early at the cafe tucked between old bookstores and city trees. The same place where, decades ago, she and Jonathan had shared milkshakes and homework and sibling dreams. He arrived 10 minutes later, less polished than usual, dressed in jeans and a navy hoodie. He spotted her and smiled, something softer than the bravado he wore at the wedding. They ordered coffee, talked first about safe things, weather, their mother's new garden, the new puppy his wife had adopted. But eventually, he leaned in, elbows on the table. You didn't humiliate me, he said quietly. You could have, but you didn't. You just did your job. Claire sipped her coffee. That's the point, Jonathan. It was never personal. He nodded, eyes lowered. I always thought you were running away from the family. I didn't realize you were running towards something bigger. He looked at her now with something close to admiration. You're the real deal. Always were. Claire didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She simply asked how he planned to fix the budget discrepancy. He laughed, a bit embarrassed. I'm already on it. Rebuilt the entire flowchart with external auditors. I even used your team's security recommendation. She raised an eyebrow. And it worked? He grinned. Better than we expected. They stayed another hour, talking, remembering, laughing. Something thawed between them, not entirely healed, but softened. They walked out together, and for the first time in years, Claire felt like she had a brother again. Not because he finally understood everything, but because he wanted to. And that was a beginning. 2 weeks later, Claire returned to her parents' estate for a quiet dinner. No gala, no guests, just her parents, Jonathan, and Isabel. The gates still gleamed, the lawn still trimmed with machine-like precision, and the foyer still echoed with footsteps over marble. But this time, something felt different. Her mother greeted her at the door with open arms and a warmth that hadn't felt forced. Will you stay the night? She asked gently. Your old room is exactly as you left it. Claire smiled. You sure it's not filled with Jonathan's trophies? Evelyn laughed, a little too loud, and said, I made room. Inside, the walls bore the same polished perfection as before, portraits of Harold at business summits, Jonathan on magazine covers, but now, between 2 golden sconces in the hallway, hung a new frame. Claire stopped mid-step. It was a photograph of her at the NATO summit, standing at attention in full dress uniform, shaking hands with a global defense leader. Below it, in careful handwriting, a plaque read, Colonel Claire Monroe, Architect of Silence, Defender of the Stars. She stared at it longer than she meant to. Who? She began. Her father stepped beside her, hands clasped behind his back. I hung it, he said quietly. And I chose the caption. Because I finally understand what you do. What it takes. She turned to look at him. He looked older, not tired, but changed. Like someone who had been forced to examine their own reflection for the first time. He extended a hand, not stiff, not rehearsed, and she shook it. Thank you, she said. Not for the photo, but for finally seeing me. Dinner was calm, familiar in an unfamiliar way. They asked questions, real ones. Her mother wanted to know what artificial intelligence in military operations actually meant. Her father, surprisingly, asked about orbital radiation shielding. Jonathan brought up encryption standards, joking that Solantra might one day need to poach her. Claire explained everything in simple terms, watching as they listened, not to be polite but to understand. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking her world to fit theirs. They were expanding theirs to meet hers. After dessert, Claire stepped out to the garden, the same garden she once ran through barefoot as a child chasing fireflies. The night was cool, the stars above clear and sharp. Her mother followed with a knitted shawl and draped it over Claire's shoulders. Still forget jackets, don't you? Evelyn teased. Claire chuckled. Some things never change. Evelyn looked up at the sky, then down at her daughter. I never said it, she whispered, but I'm proud of you. Not because of the medals. But because you never stopped doing what you believed was right, even when we didn't believe in you. Claire felt her throat tighten. Thank you, Mom. Just promise me one thing, Evelyn added, eyes glistening. Don't stay away so long again. Claire nodded. I won't. The next morning, when she packed to leave, she found a handwritten note tucked into her travel folder. Her father's handwriting. It read, You didn't just earn your place at the table. You built the whole map. Thank you for reminding me what leadership really means. She folded the note and placed it in the breast pocket of her uniform, right beside her badge. The road ahead would still be full of battles, political, tactical, personal. But now, at least, she wouldn't be walking it as a stranger to her own blood. Her family had finally turned to face her. And they had seen a soldier, a scientist, a sister, a daughter. They had seen Claire. And more importantly, they had seen who she had always been. Weeks later, Claire found herself sitting alone on the rooftop terrace of her modest apartment in Colorado Springs. It was late, long past midnight. The city lights twinkled in the distance, quiet beneath the stars she had spent her life studying, defending, and chasing. Her uniform hung neatly inside. Her inbox was full. Reports awaited her signature. But tonight, none of it mattered. What mattered was the silence, the calm, unbroken silence that only came when something inside had settled. For years, Claire had believed she needed to earn her family's approval by becoming extraordinary. She had run faster, climbed higher, studied deeper. Not for applause, but for proof. Proof that the choice she made, the path of honor, of discipline, of invisible victories, was not a rejection of them but an embrace of something truer. And yet, the more she achieved, the more they drifted. Until she no longer expected them to see her at all. Now, after all the medals, the missions, the lonely victories, they finally did. But the realization was bittersweet. Not because she needed their praise. She didn't. She never had. The ache, she now understood, came from being unseen by the people who had shaped her. The sadness was not in the distance but in the silence that filled it. Recognition had come. Respect had followed. But it was the journey of becoming whole without either that defined her. Claire looked at the stars above. Cold, brilliant, infinite. So much of what she did was for a world that would never know her name. And that, she realized, was the truest kind of purpose. Not all legacies are built in boardrooms or broadcast on screens. Some are carried quietly in the choices no one sees, in the nights no one thanks you for, in the integrity that never gets framed. For those over 50, who may have spent decades carrying invisible burdens, sacrificing for families that never quite understood their quiet strength. This was her message: value isn't always loud. Love isn't always eloquent. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is not the one the world praises, but the one that lives in the hearts of those who stayed the course without applause. Claire closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled. She no longer needed her father's words to stand tall. She had stood tall long before he spoke. But hearing them, at last, was like light warming the cold edges of an old scar. Not healing it completely, but honoring it, and that, in the end, was enough. As the wind stirred, she stood and went inside. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new threats, new weight, but tonight she allowed herself peace. In a world that had once overlooked her, Claire had not only found her place, she had proven that even in silence, even in shadows, you can build a life of quiet power. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world turns around and finally sees you standing there, exactly as you are. Whole, unapologetic, and free.